What is the city in speech? To understand this concept better, let's take a look at the step-by-step process that Socrates, Glaucon, and Adeimantus followed to create an ideal imaginary city. Remember, Socrates suggests building a city in speech to better understand how justice works within a society. By doing this, he hopes that he and his friends will be able to understand the concept of justice in an individual. First, Socrates and Adeimantus discuss the things that are absolutely necessary for living: food, housing, and clothing. With these agreed upon, Socrates concludes that the city of utmost necessity would need only 4 or 5 men. But how would these men divide the work? Would each man provide his own food, shelter, and clothing, or would they each work at a specific task and share with the others? Adeimantus says, one man, one art, meaning that each man would have a specialty. Socrates points out that the farmer would need other craftsmen to create his tools, as would the other men, and thus begins to increase the population of the city to include carpenters, smiths, and herdsmen, house builders, weavers, and cobblers. Socrates also points out that to support even a small city, there would need to be men who import items from outside to help sustain their needs. This introduces the idea of trade, which means that the city would need to produce more goods than just those to satisfy the needs of the citizens. In order to ship the goods, they would need ships, shipbuilders, sailors, merchants, and still more people to support the needs of the city. In order to establish a market based on more than just trading, the city would need a form of currency. From this comes the need for tradesmen and wage earners, the men who sell goods, and the men who sell the strength of their bodies in return for money. At this point, the city has grown to hundreds, perhaps thousands of citizens. At this point, Socrates asks Adeimantus, where in it then would justice and injustice be? Adeimantus replies, I cannot think unless it's somewhere in some need these men have of one another. Glaucon chimes in, telling Socrates that he has forgotten to give the people of his city any luxuries. Glaucon asks Socrates to provide his people with couches to lounge upon, relishes to season their food, and tables to eat from. Socrates agrees and insists that the city must again grow in order to provide such luxuries. Socrates says, the healthy city isn't adequate anymore, but must already be gorged with a bulky mass of things which are not in cities because of necessity. Hunters and imitators, artists and poets and musicians, actors and dancers, teachers, wet nurses, governesses, beauticians and barbers, relish makers and cooks, and doctors to treat all the people who indulge to excess. But to provide all of these things, the city will need to grow in land, and so must steal land from its neighbors, likely sparking war and enmity. Because of this, Socrates tells his friends that the city will need an entire army to protect its citizens and its property from other cities. In order to create an adequate army, Socrates shows that the men that they choose must have natures that are compatible with the art of war, and train them from an early age in the art of war and only this art. Socrates asserts that the men of the army, the guardians, must be spirited, and they must be gentle to their own while they are cruel to their enemies. To achieve this, Socrates determines that the guardians must be lovers of learning and wisdom. They must be philosophers. Socrates, Adeimantus, and Glaucon discuss the kind of education that the guardians must receive to serve the city: gymnastics and music, heroic studies, and they will only hear stories that do not make them fear death or the afterlife, but only slavery, so that they will fight fiercely when the time comes to do battle. The guardians should be trained from a young age to tell the truth, to enjoy food, drink, and sex in moderation, and to hear only stories of honorable and just deeds. Next, Socrates, Adeimantus, and Glaucon discuss the leaders in the city. They determine that the best leader would be the best of the guardians, a man who loves the city and only wants to do what would be advantageous to it. From a young age, they would test children of the guardian class for strength, mental fortitude, and self-control. Those that passed the tests would be reared up as future leaders. These leaders then would be called guardians, and the rest would be called auxiliaries. Then Socrates describes a noble lie that would allow this city to function. Socrates' noble lie is as follows: we will attempt to persuade the guardians and the auxiliaries, then the rest of the city, that the rearing and education we gave them were like dreams. They only thought they were undergoing all that was happening to them, while in truth at that time they were under the earth within, being fashioned and reared themselves, and their arms and other tools being crafted. When the job had been completely finished, then the earth, which is their mother, sent them up. And now, as though the land they were in were a mother and nurse, they must plan for and defend it if anyone attacks. And they must think of the other citizens as brothers born of the earth. All of you in the city are certainly brothers, we shall say to them in telling the tale. But the god, in fashioning those of you who are competent to rule, mixed in gold at their birth. This is why they are most honored. In auxiliaries, silver, and iron and bronze in the farmers and other craftsmen. Finally, Socrates and his friends discuss how the auxiliaries and guardians must live so that they will not turn on the people that they are meant to protect. They conclude that, in addition to their education and upbringing, the guardians and auxiliaries must be provided with adequate food, shelter, and clothing. They must not own any property beyond what is absolutely necessary. They must not touch any gold or silver. They must eat together, and they will share wives, and children will be raised in common. In this way, the guardians and auxiliaries will have everything that they need to live and rule, and will not be tempted to enslave the rest of the population for their own benefit. After much conversation, Socrates, Adeimantus, and Glaucon decide that they have constructed the most virtuous city, where wisdom, courage, and moderation guide the inhabitants and create a just population. In the end, it is clear that this city in speech is a metaphor for the individual. The leader represents intellect, the auxiliaries represent spirit, and the common men represent the appetite. Socrates concludes that justice exists within the individual when all of these attributes work together in harmony, and injustice exists when these attributes are imbalanced.